new cases the previous week. That 6% figure was absolutely constant. And then it's starting to shift.
Yeah. Cool. Well, maybe we'll get rolling. So there, yeah. So Spencer and his team reached out a week or so ago. Sort of talking about their work, and we sort of quickly decided that it would be cool to share it in office hours. I like kind of like flocking back and forth between kind of our just general open discussions and sharing work. So that's cool. And so some more of that is starting to be planned for future office hours, which is cool. So next week, tentatively, we'll share a project that we did internally at the Near Future Laboratory. And yeah, so if anyone knows or thinks of anything that might be worth sort of slightly more formally sharing as opposed to just sort of discussing, definitely reach out. There's one thing that I wanted to share, not share, but just like mention just briefly before we start. And I'm doing this in the kind of like the fullness of our kind of like open discussion where we're totally comfortable and fine presenting things which might be completely cockamamie or something. And just as a way to kind of get people's sort of perspective and insight. But and it was, I'll frame it this way. So it was, I was walking the dog yesterday and I had just a kind of like it was like a bit of an epiphany, but it might be complete crap, that I just quickly jotted down on my phone because I didn't want to forget it. Because sometimes you have an epiphany, and then you're like, "Oh, that's brilliant," and then you get home, like half an hour later, and you're like, "What the hell was that? I don't even know what I was." Just the general topic area. What the hell was it? But so I wrote this one down, and it's just this kind of ongoing dialogue or in my head as we're working in the Near Future Laboratory on this book project, and just trying to find like those really effective ways for describing what design fiction is. And yeah, so it's that. And I think, we're always sort of evolving this. Like, I'm less inclined to have like, the one canonical definition that captures all aspects of it, as opposed to kind of, compelling nuggets that help people get their head around what it is and what it's good for and how it operates. And so here comes the potential crap. And if there's like dead air for like several moments after this, we can just move along. So the basic structure was that design uses form in order to represent ideas, and fiction uses story to represent ideas. And that binary was something that resonated insofar as you have this mix of like tangible and kind of narrative, and that these almost represented like in some essential way the ways in which humans sort of operate in the world. And what I was trying to get to is that it's almost like this pairing of, and I'm not always entirely comfortable with this kind of metaphor, but like left brain, right brain kinds of things. So you have these essential characters of human imagination, and its representation in the kind of material things. So we're uniquely able to like manipulate the world around us in material ways by making things and creating representations of kind of physical things. And then we also, as we sort of have come to appreciate and understand, we also understand the world through story. And so it's almost like bringing those two things together, which as I'm saying, it sounds like incredibly kind of obvious, which is maybe good, as opposed to being kind of like clever and obscure and trying to establish some kind of, new understanding of what it is to be human. And so I come back to this example, which, or just this kind of image that came when I was meeting with some folks at RGA last winter, and they were sort of describing like, well, we kind of do we do this kind of like futury kind of stuff, but it's mostly from a business perspective. So, and we started using the spreadsheet as a kind of representation of that. And I found that really compelling because, you can, there's a way in which you can think of a spreadsheet, or let's say like a business model, a future facing business model, as a representation of a future. And I was like, aha, okay. So these kinds of spreadsheets are trying to tell a story about a possible future. They're trying to project what things might look like in a really kind of, hyper analytic way. But spreadsheets aren't really good at telling stories. It takes a lot more kind of experience and skill to look at a spreadsheet and interpret a story. It's super terse. Like there's nothing really engaging about it for most mortals. Um, but effectively, what design fiction is doing is would do in the context of a spreadsheet is transform that into a much more um, a much more legible or digestible story about what that future represents. And I'm thinking about that for a very particular context, but that essentially the formulation. So design represents by using form, and fiction represents through story. So that's it.
One of the things that jumps out to me is that form plus story dyad turns up in experience design quite a bit. And digging into it, the people who have worked a little bit on the psychology of this, what they point out is that both of those tap into built-in capabilities that humans use to understand their environment. I recall reading an article a while ago that talked about why soap operas are so popular. It's because humans actually have deeply ingrained neuro and cognitive mechanisms for keeping track of relationships among people, and watching a soap opera exercises this: who's sleeping with who owes what to who's fighting with who, and so so story, the ability to pay attention to and detect story, is actually built into our brains at a pretty deep level. And similarly with using physical interaction as a way of comprehending our environment, being able to pick up and manipulate things is really important. I think there's a story from, I think, Herbert Simon, the systems guy who wrote The Sciences of the Artificial, who I think used the metaphor of a scissor with two blades, where your mental and cognitive capacities are one side of the blade, but the physical environment is the other part of it, right? And we underestimate how much that matters. For example, the example you gave with ants have little tiny brains, right? But they use their physical environment as a way to extend their cognitive system. For example, they'd leave a pheromone trail, and there's things about the environment that you can count on, that the environment doesn't suddenly change, that for the most part, if you leave a trail, it'll persist. And so the network of pheromone tracks that the ant is laying down, in effect, is amplifying their cognitive capacities, right? And our brains are designed to make use of that. They know that if I put a thing here, if nothing else happens to it, it'll stay there. Hence the value of, large scale whiteboards, right? You can jot stuff on a whiteboard and you can turn around and point to it. You no longer have to remember everything that's on the whiteboard, but you can remember where that key point was. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah.
Right. So we're pre-wired for both those things. We're pre-wired for story, and we are pre-wired to understand physical environments and be able to rely on aspects of our physical environment to hold environment. So yeah, so I think this is a really powerful idea.
I think that often when we think about cognition and the way we are in the world, we tend to forget the body as a crucial part of our cognitive mechanisms. And so, embodied subjectivity is kind of what consciousness is. We tend to localize consciousness in the brain, but our physical intellect, if you will, like our ability to navigate the world, is is a cognitive kind of capacity. You point to ants using pheromones. We have other sorts of navigating mechanisms that are passed down, I think, from an evolutionary manner, that have enabled us to navigate the world in a way that enriches, that's kind of led to our intellectual development, so that, you know, separating, it's all goes back to Descartes, right? And separating the mind and the body, when in fact the mind and the body are not separate, and consciousness is, you know, the body is infused with consciousness. It's just that we don't typically think of it that way in the West, anyway.
There's a great book by Devanshi Chauhan called Job's Body. Have you come across it? It's a manual of physiology for body workers, for people who are giving massage and everything. And what he points out, and this is not woo-woo stuff, it's pretty well backed up, is that the body contains numerous systems for memory and learning, right? It's not just the nervous system and the brain. The immune system can develop a memory. The connective tissue can develop a memory for repeated stress and things. So the lymphatic system can actually capture learning and retain a memory. So yeah, the entire body as a system for learning and embodying cognition is quite a big deal. And so this idea of bringing story into the physical world and being able to tap into it is really big.
I guess maybe just briefly, the one of the reasons why I think I was, you know, sort of momentarily intrigued by kind of like almost like saying that out loud, was because I'm trying to understand why, you know, I personally find the approach so compelling, and why I find it so I guess like you know, like effective is a weird word to say, because then someone's gonna say like, well, what's your key indicator of, you know, of it, and effective by what percentage and those kinds of things. But I just find it, you know, I'm trying to back into like why I feel so strongly about this as an effective approach for helping you know, imagine possible worlds, and the aspect of it, you know, and so the context, I guess more broadly, and just briefly, I won't prattle on too much about it, but like for my other company, I'm trying to create this representation of the future, and it's all you know, it's all part of like a business process, and it's the way it started, and it's been going for a while now. Is basically, you know, I've got this incredibly articulate, I commissioned this incredibly articulate like business model. It's this mother of all spreadsheets that's got tons of levers in it to be able to project what each and every department in the company contributes to the overall business. And it's purely a matrix of numbers. It's just an Excel spreadsheet with a zillion tabs, and you know, you dig in there. And it just occurs to me as I've been working with this, is like, oh, this is okay, this is cool. I can get my head around this, because I'm using this to try to tell a future story. My future story happens to have like, you know, the main actors in it are who you hire and when and for how much and what department do they operate in. But when you do all that, I'm like looking at it, I'm like, this is just a bunch of numbers. There's no kind of substance here, or there's no story here. And so what I've been doing is, you know, it's ironic, like I didn't think of doing this, but someone told me, it's like, why don't you just do what you normally do? Is I'm now, that spreadsheet is now essentially just like the bones of a richer story. And that richer story, which is actually harder to do than the spreadsheet, is to do the annual report for the year-end report for the company from the year 2024. So essentially the spreadsheet goes out to 2024. And I could just say, like, here's the spreadsheet, and, you know, pour through it. Or I could create literally like a book that's the annual report from the future that looks back and essentially adds the narrative, the beautiful like kind of design fiction narrative, along with things like not just saying we're going to do 3 new products or that kind of thing, but like here they are, and here's how they performed, and here's what the market, how the market responded to them, and adding that, essentially adding the story to this kind of like vacuous grid of boxes and numbers. Anyway, so that's what I was trying to figure out. You're anticipating the thing where someone's like, I don't get this. Like, what is it? The 2024? Like, what the heck? What's wrong with you? And then, explaining why I think this is, and it's not, no one's done that yet. Like when I shared it just with a few friends, they've all been like, okay, this is cool. Like, I get this. Now this is a way of kind of like telling me what you would probably have to tell me anyway if I just had the spreadsheet, but doing it in a kind of maybe more visually impactful way. That's it.
Yeah, I'm just adding some comments in the chat, but what you're saying resonates with me, Julian. I think in the work that I have been doing for the last few years, like I have to do all 3, or at least pull it out of the team. So some parts of the organization do their forecasts based on the lens through which they look at the business, the future. It's the levers they can pull, right? And there's a story that they tell themselves, right? That it doesn't often get communicated. So it's like an assumption, and often in that assumption is a bias. Just like anyone who might write just science fiction has maybe, like the cover of the book has an image, right? But otherwise there's not imagery. And then design, people who are form makers maybe aren't the best writers or financial forecasters. But bringing those 3 things together, like John, is that how you say your name? John Pablo?
Yeah, John Pablo, yeah.
Is like in experience design, these 3 things come together. And I find they're become the most rich speculative fictions.
Yeah.
I've found. I can't avoid the business piece in any of the stuff I do, because people always want to, well, what's the business implication of that scenario?
Yeah.
So I think it's just like what people are used to using in their everyday life. I'm guessing, well, knowing you, like, well, you're adept. So like you created this Excel thing, right? So in moving it around, you're like imagining alternatives, it sounds like, but it's not your go-to. And maybe the form making or writing is a thing you aspire to be, but I don't know, I'm making this up, but aspire to be better at, or the way you learn is through seeing or writing, all those things. Because a lot of this is apprehending something different from what we currently know. So I'm assuming like our multiple intelligences and those kinds of things play into this as well.
Yeah, I mean, so just to be clear, like my accountant created the spreadsheet.
Oh,
but like it was actually when I think about it, it was very much a collaborative thing, insofar as like, totally we can do this, and we do this. This is normal. This is part of our standard stock and trade of services that we offer. But then then there's a conversation. It's like, well, okay, so what is it that you want to kind of represent in it?
Yeah.
And so you can say like, well, I want these kinds of, I imagine, I imagine, that there are these departments, sales, marketing, branding, design, engineering, like all the kind of stuff. And then literally I remember him saying like, well, okay, so if we were to project out, like 5 years, like how many products do you think you'll have? Like, okay, good question. Because they were going to build that out. Product 1, product 2, product 3. How many do you want there? Oh, an accessories line. You're going to do accessories? Oh yeah, sure. That sounds, yeah, do accessories. What about merchandise? Yes. And when you said merchandise, I was like, I've always wanted to do like the world's greatest, like You guys know these things, keybacks? You know what a keyback is? It's like if you've ever had like a
Based on
building
that gesture.
superintendent and they've got a key ring and they've got a zillion keys on it and they go like this and it kind of snaps back. Like I've always wanted to do like the world's just like the best keyback because all the ones out there suck. So like, yeah, let's do accessories. Give me 10 accessories that I can possibly do. And they're just open-ended things. It's almost like almost like saying chapter 6, keyback. And okay, right. Well, what is that? How does that fit into the whole plot? And then you have to do, it's actually the harder work than what I would argue the harder work and the work that I think most of us might be like really interested in. We're not interested. I mean, we're less interested in the general, general idea that, let's say just in this example, which is maybe not the best, that a company has a future because that's how, you can assume that, and they sell stuff or they provide services. And then you don't want to stop there. It's like, well, what's it going to be like? What would I want to do? What would be a cool thing to offer to the world? And then you got to do the deep work to say like, now I'm just kind of going through these like fun kind of design discussions like, okay, Julian, but why a keyback? And why does that make sense? Good question. Let me tell that story. And let me create an image of why this makes sense in this this context. And a lot of it has to do, it's just, and that's when you get into like the DNA of the enterprise to a large degree. You don't just say we're going to sell stuff at a decent margin, and in order to be able to sustain the enterprise and bring shareholder value, like that's kind of the bland MBA definition of what it is to be like an entrepreneur. But you want to do more, and so. The interesting thing about this process that I'm learning is that it's really, really hard, which is good because you want to go through that work of, conceiving of what this future looks like, not just in the abstract. And this even occurs to me in the context of the discussions we've been having like the last week or two about imagining a world where, defunded police, like, okay, got it. But that's sort of like saying like, I want a world that's better. And then you say like, well, how are you going to make it better? Well, I'm going to defund police. Okay, what does that world actually look like? How do you get there? Tell that story. Along the way of understanding that it might be a possible way of making the world better. And that's the hard work. I think that's the harder work.
You remember how I mentioned about that? Like, go find a place where that future exists already.
Yeah. By
chance, through another thing, there's a good Canadian news program called The National, similar to like PBS NewsHour kind of. And I just happened to look at it yesterday, and they were showing in Sweden, I believe, where there was a mental health unit that was called instead of the police. And they had done the research to be like, where does such a thing exist in the world for that kind of, they had the same question and they'd found it somewhere, and they were, of course, then interviewing people about what's it been like to have such a thing.
Yeah, cool. If you can dig out that link, it'd be great to shove through the chat.
We did that in the eastern suburbs of Pittsburgh in 1975. We had, I was director of the outpatient unit of a community mental health center, and we worked with the local police departments. And so we had what was then called a diversion program, where calls would come into the police that had a mental health, at least to their dispatchers' ears, had a mental health element to it. And they would call our emergency unit, and our emergency unit would go out with the police and would very quickly determine whether or not the police were necessary in the situation or not, and most often take over from there.
Yeah, good stuff.
That was before mental health services were destroyed in the United States by Ronald Reagan, but that's another story.
Check. Cool. Okay, anything else on that topic, or should we move to chapter 2?
I just was going to add, like, in the repertoire of design fiction, there's no reason you can't do or include a value prop. I mean, there's all these business type canvases that exist for like near-term horizons usually, but there's no reason I've been doing this. You can't use them for something further out, because you just, all of the customer parts, pains, gains, whatever terms are used, you just use the speculative part as the input. But you can just run all the same thing, like high margin, high frequency, blah, 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 blah. All of those criteria can be used to further push, like what you were just describing. Keyback? How is the keyback? How is this thing on brand? Like, what's the story of the thing that it's on brand, that it's somehow about the attributes of whatever is this for Amada? Has the technical prowess, whatever, analog, et cetera, attitude that the brand also has. And then how does it contribute to the business, or how does it extend the business? But in what world is that? Would change maybe how the thing exists. Maybe it's not maybe it's a free thing because of some scenario.
Right.
Versus it's a extremely rare thing, right?
Yeah.
Like Kanye just signed a 10-year deal with Gap. So I don't know what's going to happen with brands going forward in terms of what they're offering and how they're a bit able to change and whatnot. So brands and the business of brands is totally input for this stuff.
Yeah, definitely.
Hey, Scott, just to play off what you were just talking about with value prop ideas, something I've done, mixing in the story conversation, something I've done, especially with student startup founders and just in general, is taking the stories down to the 6-word story genre. I'm sure you're all familiar with 6-word stories, and actually trying to use those like value props in the form of 6-word stories that, you know, that you can engage someone emotionally in every way that you need to about what, you know, show that you understand them, their needs, their desires, as well as what you're offering, all within a 6-word story. And I try to argue to them that if you can't represent your value proposition in a 6-word story or close to that, you shouldn't really be going any further in, you know, building anything and so on. So I really like that use of story all the way down, even to just 6 words being that powerful.
Yeah, that's good. I have a small collection of like these kind of little microfiction you know, like little collections of little stories that kind of get to that point as well. Just that thing, you know, if you can tell a story that, or if you can, you know, express an entire world in just like a little kind of compelling container, you've gotten pretty close to like sort of capturing, yeah, the whole that whole world in that brief context. It's super hard.
Yeah, one pattern is I own a bunch of these books on microfiction, and you know, there's a couple books on 6-word story memoirs, especially there's a great book on immigration, 6-word stories, memoirs. And what I found, at least maybe just from the ones I've been able to see, is that it's much easier to tell a sad, kind of poignant, sad, and, you know, for design fiction, I'd say dystopian story in 6 words. I haven't seen as many examples of positive stories. And I don't know if maybe the form lends itself better to, you know, like the famous Hemingway one, where when you tell the 6 words, it lingers, and we kind of finish it and play it out in our mind. And I wonder if maybe the sadder stories are easier, or they happen easier that way. But I'm always on the lookout for more positive examples, because I want to use them, again, for value proposition statements, not for sad statements as much.
Yeah, that's really interesting, that point. Yeah, I mean, it just, there's the one story I'm thinking about, which I won't say because I'll get it all wrong, and then it won't be 6 words, and I'll have to search for the book or something. But it was definitely, you know, profoundly sad. The implication was profoundly sad. Yeah.
Well, if you think about the what are often kind of referred to as sort of the six primary emotions: fear, anger, disgust, sadness, surprise, and joy. Four of them are negative, right off the bat: fear, anger, disgust, and sadness. So evoking those four is probably easier. Surprise can go either way, right? And joy is the only one that's really good or positive out of that. And so it may be harder in a few words to trigger joy than it is to trigger one of the others.
Interesting. Okay, well, should we move? Thanks for all that. That was super helpful. I really appreciate your thoughts and reflections on my dog walking epiphany. So, Spencer, do you want to? Should I turn things over to you?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having us. We really appreciate the invite and the ability to kind of talk about what we worked on with y'all. Can I share my screen? Is that a possibility, or is it host?
Yeah, you should be able to, but let me know.
Okay, I'm gonna attempt that now. Okay. Let's try this.
There it goes.
Okay. So, hi everybody. I'm Spencer. My teammates Jen and Devanshi are also on this call. We are recent graduates of the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering at the University of Washington. And for our capstone project, we decided we sort of tripped and fell into design fiction. And we had a blast doing it. And the work of Near Future Labs was very motivating to us, including actual quotes from y'all making it into some of our artifacts. And we thought that this is kind of a new thing for us. Our program is not really focused on this. I think our professor told us we're the first people to ever do design fiction for capstone. So if it's cool with y'all, I can kind of walk you through what we did, our process, and I would love to get your thoughts on it as people who do this and deal with this professionally. Is that cool? Sweet. Yeah, our program is very UX focused, so this is kind of written up sort of as a UX case study. But hopefully that one of the questions that I would love to ask you guys at the end of all this is how design fiction and UX can kind of coexist. And it was interesting earlier listening to you all talk about experience design, because that's really what we felt like we were doing. So, Living with the Future, human-centered design fiction. We created 4 fictional artifacts set in the year 2030 around a fictional co-living community, shared housing, roommate, corporate style, as a way to think about the problems that people face when living together, the problems they've always faced, and how changing technology could affect that. It also ended up sort of by accident being kind of an indictment of the entire solutionist approach to design that we're kind of dealing with a lot, both in academia and in industry, where all you're focused on is designing the solution to a problem, you don't always think through the possible impact. So we created a fictional corporate website to kind of pitch our product. We created a news article to introduce it to people. We created a podcast where we had the fake CEO talk about it and some of the design concepts. And then to tie it all together, we created a Medium blog post from the future as a sort of critique of the things we presented in the first 3 artifacts. So for us, why design fiction? We knew going into this that we really wanted to work in speculative and discursive design. Like I said, it's really uncommon in our program, but we had a very supportive professor. We had no idea where this was going to end when we started. We just sort of kind of trusted in the human-centered design process, and that led us from one thing into another. We really wanted to challenge ourselves to move beyond just designing an app or a product, as the case is, and there's nothing wrong with that. We just felt like, when else are we going to have the opportunity to do this sort of work? I mean, you know, you guys do it for a living, but many of us won't get that opportunity working in industry. We wanted the freedom to critique the things we created. By far the hardest thing for us was offering that critique in a way that doesn't bias the user or the audience. And as we go through this, that's kind of a point that I'm going to keep coming back to. And so then the question of why co-living? All of us had lived with roommates throughout most of our adult lives. The problems, as I said, of people living together are as old as people, and they can, in my view, every time we solve one problem of people living together, we kind of create a new one. So it was interesting for us to investigate that. And the percentage of the population living together as roommates has jumped by like 12% each decade since the 90s. And now it's up to like 33% of adults live with roommates. So we felt that this would be an interesting problem space to explore. Now, Julian, how do you, I have like a 3-minute intro video to our project. Would you like me to show that, or should I just keep talking? It's kind of a good, useful introduction to what we're doing.
If it's good and useful, yeah, go ahead and share it.
Okay, sweet. I think I have my, hold on. Oh, hold on, I have to turn on. Okay. All right. There should be sound, but it's just background soundtrack. So if you don't hear sound and you're hearing the words or seeing the words, that's fine. So I'm going to shut up for a minute and let you guys read a quote from yourselves.
Make a wish. Count to 3. Come with me and you'll be in a world of pure imagination. Take a look.
Okay. On that note from Willy Wonka, we will continue the presentation. So what makes our project a little unusual in the design fiction, relative to design fiction works we've seen, is that it's very text heavy. We do have some diegetic prototypes, but it's what we wanted to create here was a community, and then like interact with the concepts created in that community through things like user stories, but turn them into actual fiction. So this is our process. And in the interest of time, I'm going to skip through some of this. We did a bunch of research, cultural probes, which is story design workshops, and we identified 4 problem areas with people living together: chores, resource sharing, privacy and personal boundaries, and then creating like a sense of community amongst people living together. We sent out these cultural probes to people, asking them to do things like visualize their roommates as different animals and draw us a picture of their perfect house. And in the top right corner, you see a very abstract drawing of the social dynamic in one home. In our participatory design workshops, we asked people to look at these postcards from the year 1900 from France, where they engaged in their own form of design fiction and speculative design to picture what the year 2000 might look like, to ask our participants how they might envision the future of people living together. Those design workshops gave us a lot of really interesting concepts to work with. But at this point in our research, we weren't yet sure we wanted to do design fiction. We were still working in speculative design. And this is one of those cases of just kind of trusting in the process. And we got here to the end of our research, and we had all this research on co-living and the problems people have, and we kind of didn't know where to go. So we had all these learnings about, co-living and whatnot. I'm not going to go into all that. But our professor sent us this short story by Nnedi Okorafor, if you're familiar with her. She's a Nigerian American author, about a smart house in the future and a woman's interaction with it. And we thought, what a great way to synthesize our research findings. Let's each of the 4 of us in our group create a piece of fiction that somehow incorporates our research findings. And we took a weekend to do that. Devanshi and I both wrote, Jen and I wrote short stories. Devanshi created like a fictional advertisement script. And then Christina, who's our artistic one, like drew a comic. Like here's a still from her comic. And when we did this, it kind of clicked for us. We said we could do this as a whole project. Like we had a lot of fun doing it. We felt like it was the best way to represent what we were doing, which is looking at how people live together in the future. But we didn't know what we wanted to create. We had to create something, and we wanted whatever we made to be, I don't think controversial is the word, but at least to like discursive, I think is probably the term we wanted. But we didn't want to just design something bad and then have people comment on how bad it was, because then they just think we're bad designers. So we needed a way to create, to build in our own critique of these designs as a sort of like critique of both culture and of the designs themselves. So our first idea was inspired by this picture of cell phones through the ages, which is, we were going to have a number of diegetic artifacts set across different time periods, 2030, 2040, and 2050. We felt like doing that would enable us to show through change in technology, like a growth in the design concepts, but thinking that far out and trying to world build each of these 3 scenarios felt pretty arbitrary and like a lot of guesswork. And we felt the work involved to world build 3 scenarios didn't make as much sense as diving deep into one. So now we had all this, and now we had 3 sort of layers of deliverable that we were dealing with, which is, first of all, designing a community to solve the problems of living together using futuristic technology like artificial intelligence. The second was designing a narrative to present that community to an audience. And the third was designing the experience of consuming that narrative, right? Like, what is the user experience of interacting with our narrative about our community, which was a couple levels more than we were used to dealing with. So we came up with a list of design requirements and how we wanted to craft this project. And you can see them here. I'm not going to read all of them, but we felt that the first thing we needed to do was world building. You can see there at point number 4. We had all these design concepts and ideas from our research, but before we really designed the artifacts themselves, we had to build a world. So we started with creating a series of fake advertisements set in 2030 to kind of help us get into character, as it were. My personal favorite is Devanshi's Fast and Furious 21. You see over there on the side. We also created a kind of fictional background corporation that creates the AI that runs our community. So we created this whole idea that this community, all social interactions are moderated by artificial intelligence. There is a system of points and games to incentivize people to be better community members. And then we wanted to create some sort of device to visualize the previous 2 concepts, the social interactions and the points and games. So the first thing we talked about was this product that our teammate Christina designed visually, which was essentially sort of like a wall clock or stand-up thing that visualized your points that you've been awarded by the AI, and the 3 colors being these 3 different metrics that we felt like we were going to measure each person on, which was cleanliness, sustainability, and harmony. And we felt like each apartment would be scored on these 3 metrics, which would contribute, along with the actions you took in your daily life, to this score. And that would incentivize people to be better community members and roommates while they're being watched over by this AI, heavily inspired by Richard Brautigan's 1967 poem, All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace. And what we realized is designing a speculative prototype is really the same as designing any other type of prototype, right? Like, every product is fictional until it's not. So this part saw us still kind of sticking to that whole sort of user-centered design process, but we're like entering this fictional world. But then we started concept mapping out our artifacts and thinking about, this is where designing the narrative comes into play, and then thus the experience of the narrative. So for our apartment website, we had to create a believable experience outlining the amenities and services of this co-living community to serve as a website for the corporation. And I will just scroll through this quickly. So this website kind of forms the basis of our community. This is where we show the promise of what we want people to take away from our community, what they hope it's capable of. Here's our fictional CEO, a list of amenities. Because our design was based around a community, it was really difficult to sort of have a designed artifact, aside from the clock thing I discussed, the at-home device. But this was originally our sole idea, like, oh, let's give them this. And while people reading through this are going to get some red flags, we needed to be able to offer critique and to like introduce people to this world, et cetera, so on and such forth. Here's our like value statement. Our fictional our AI corporation, here we put them in with a bunch of other fictional corporations from sci-fi to kind of make the connection in some users' heads that this is sort of an ominous thing. We wanted to remain neutral in our presentation of the concepts, but also that this the process by which the concepts are implemented is not perfect. So after we designed the product and then we designed the website, we designed our news article, whose entire purpose is to kind of introduce people to this world. It's a news article about a press release. You see our mention of Cirrus. We've got a fake advertisement. This is all done by Devanshi. It's excellent. Join Trump Space Force. We have like things like most popular headlines, right? Like to kind of give people a sense of what's going on in the world around this and create some buy-in for this space, and hopefully like offer some delight for users. You can see the rest of our fictional ads down here as well. After we created the article and the website and the product, the device, we felt like that we had a couple problems we'd faced, which is that everything we'd done so far had really relied on text, with the exception of the sort of the diegetic prototype for the clock. And that there were some things that we needed to go in greater depth on that the previous kind of two approaches didn't afford us. So we created this whole character of the CEO and created a podcast interview with him as a shorthand stand-in for what this company was. He's a sort of white tech bro, what we would call a millennial now, but in 2030, I guess would be Gen Z. And kind of hope to imprint his personality on the user as a shorthand for the whole design, right? Like the design of our community was based on, like, if everyone just has fun, things will be great. Let's all just have a good time, without really thinking through how things like an AI constantly monitoring you, or the like relentless gamification of your day-to-day life, or constantly being able to see in real time your whole social world reduced to metrics, might impact you. So with these first three artifacts, we sort of presented the promise, like how might this go well? But then we needed a way to critique that, which is how we came up with the whole blog post idea, as a way to both present all of the artifacts to people, and offer those critiques on each of the design concepts. So in order to create those critiques, we had to think about what are those impacts. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with Artifact Group or their tarot cards of tech, but they are phenomenal design tools for thinking through design ramifications and consequences. So we went through their whole deck and looked at all of our design concepts and thought, okay, how could these go wrong, right? Like what would using our product too much look like? What could a bad actor do with our project? And we eventually wrote like 6.5 pages of impacts, and those we then had to turn into user stories and thus quotes for our piece. So here's a little map of how an idea goes from something brought up in our research all the way to a quotation in our final article. So one of our participants brought up, like, technology, whether it's an AI or otherwise, they can tell you to do something, but without incentivization, there's no reason for you to do it. Like your phone alarm goes off and you just ignore it. So that led us to creating a reward system based on earning points that score total that help you earn prizes. We made those prizes particularly lucrative. And that was our critique. Highly desirable rewards, such as free rent, could create competition and division between community members. We turned that into a user story of users feeling uncomfortable talking about those rewards with others. And then in the end, that became a quotation, which was put in our Medium article, which is structured as a series of interviews. So this is the whole, like, design the community, design the narrative, and then the experience of the narrative. Here's our concept map for that one. This is actually much longer, but before I do that, where are you? So this is this is our Medium post. It's long. And again, this is something that I'd love to hear y'all's take on, is to really present these in such a way. The whole project takes about half an hour to go through. It's not quick. And some people are like, of course not, you're building a whole world. And other people are like, that's a lot to ask of people. So we're not sure if this amount of text, we based it on the length of another article we had read in our research roughly about all this. We designed fake social media posts to kind of bring the world to life a little bit more. But it was really difficult for us to design artifacts that weren't commentary. So I'd really be interested to hear from you guys at the end of this, like how I can provide, like how we could create these things in such a way that's doesn't just force people to read, but is maybe more interactive. I'll not full screen this. So things we learned: the value of design fiction as a UX tool, like phenomenal for thinking through design concepts and impacts. It really expanded our creativity and the possibility that we felt we could bring to the project. It encouraged us to kind of think around corners and exercise muscles that we traditionally don't in the type of program we were in. Again, we exercise a ton of creativity, but this specific type was different. And I think we're all better designers as a result. Definitely learned to have faith in the process and to document it as we go. And then this whole crafting the experience of a narrative was a new thing for us, but it's like listening to you guys talk about story earlier and thinking about how much time we spent talking about narrative design. Like narrative design is like, a narrative is more than just a bunch of written words, but this is one form of it. And we go back and forth on like, to what extent is this just a story, and to what extent is this of value to design? And we see it and we understand it, but it's hard to communicate that. So some of the changes that we would make is, less text reliant, more diegetic artifacts, and some concepts that we would like to dive in deeper if we had more time. But I will leave it here and open up the floor with kind of these questions, which are, how do we do this in a less textually dense way? What's the best way to kind of simplify and present this project to people in something that's more easily digestible? And how have y'all felt is the best way to advocate for an employee design fiction in any sort of industry space? You guys were talking about business propositions earlier, but especially in a UX space. And with that, I will yield the floor. By the way, you can find our project here if you are interested in investigating it, but I'll leave the questions up and turn it back over to Julian.
What was that? It's futureliving.
Futureliving.online.
Okay. Ugh, keeps trying to correct my text. No, it's a URL. Thanks for that. Really appreciate that. Super interesting stuff. I got stuck in a good way, kind of fixated on a couple things. So this might not be well formulated, but one was, so when I many years ago, in between college and grad school, I traveled across the country, and one of the books I had was a collection of Richard Brautigan poems, and I actually never knew that poem. I was kind of like, it was, whatever collection I had, it was back before Kindles and stuff, didn't have that poem in it. So that was really, I'm just deep diving on that connection. So thanks for that.
No worries. Big fan.
Yeah. And I didn't, obviously since I didn't know the poem, I didn't know the title of it, and it hadn't occurred to me, and maybe I hadn't watched the Adam Curtis through enough to actually catch any link that he might have made in the BBC documentary, which is also amazing. So that's one thing. The other thing is I fixated on who was it that made did the illustration of the Apple Watch that says your room's gonna be locked until you clean up?
our group mate Christina, the only one who's not here today, unfortunately.
Okay, I thought that was like that was it. Like I was, I was like, that's the story right there. And so my, very humble kind of nudge would be, or would have been, if we were collaborating on this in some fashion, would have been like, that's it. That's your 6-word story. Like, just do that. Like, tell the experiences that you're kind of like unearthing in the very thorough kind of more narrative kind of description, the text part, which I think is good. I think it's good background. It's almost like the conversations that are leading to all these things. But I think there was something so impactful about that image that kind of like tips into your near future without kind of making it how'd you put it, like a lot to ask. It's almost like that could be the story itself. Like that's your 6-word moment. It's probably not 6 words, but you get the idea. Like that little nugget transports you into this world where like, wait, huh? Like doors locking? Like what kind of shared living space by Airbnb am I in? And then you start imagining like Airbnb's actually got into like the roommate referral, and it's not temporary rentals. It's like, it's monthlies or whatever. That's where I think it starts becoming, in my mind, what I find to be compelling design fiction.
For sure, yeah. One conversation that we kept having with ourselves and with each other was like, how do we effectively just drop someone off in our future? Do you know what I mean? Like, how do we give them the least amount of information they need to begin this experience and to understand where we're going with it? And I think something like Christina's art is amazing. We didn't want to rely too heavily on just her visual design skills, especially because a lot of what we were doing, we were kind of learning while going. Like she taught herself like 3D modeling just to make that clock.
So awesome. Yeah. Love that.
I'm blown away by her work. But yeah, like we originally thought about like, what if we just did the clock and the product design and then did like user manuals for it or like a welcome packet, you know what I mean? But having quarantine played a big role in all of this, in that we couldn't get together. So we couldn't, filming videos that featured people was difficult. Building physical prototypes, which was our original goal, proved difficult. So it kind of came down to text-based commentary when we evaluated our skill sets. But I don't think that any of us would have had that as our first choice. Have you experienced other projects of this variety that are like kind of like, I think about your the video y'all did with the what is it, Curious Rituals, or Superflux's Uninvited Guests, if you're familiar with that. Both of those videos were big inspirations to us. And in that, you are like, you've written the script, as it were, in the same way that we did, but you're doing so much more visually than we were able to do. And so that's where we feel like there's a little bit of disconnect with our project, but also, I don't know, the validity of it, I guess, is something that we go back and forth on.
I would just add that, kind of piggybacking on Julian's thing, that part of this effort, because you were taking on a lot, to your question of like how to more succinctly introduce someone to this, is that resonant human moment, like in that weird circular diagram of how people get along that you had in one slide, or don't. I mean, I'm agreeing with the Apple Watch, or instead of this like clean, everything works fine vision of the thing on the table, it's like someone hit it with a bat because they hate it so much, or it's hidden under the couch, or it's in the trash can, or something to show how people responded to it.
Yeah, and so that's something we describe in text, right? Like we have the quote here,
right?
You
like, could show that instead of writing it, you would just, it's like what is it? What's that? There's the candlestick in the parlor, whatever that game is. Clue.
Yeah.
If you come into this room and you're like, okay, something's off, Or the watch illustration does the same thing. You're like, captures, you're like, there's something going on here. There's some dynamic. And the initial clue is this message on my wrist, or this clock is not where I expect it to be. That is enough to be like, okay, this world is different in some way. And then you have people enough to then go into all the other pieces. But when you present it kind of neutrally, like it's working fine, there isn't a thing there. You don't understand what it's rubbing against.
Right. And so that's the, like, one of our professors said to us that to design something that just works is just wishful thinking, right? But to design something dystopian is just as bad, but sort of on the other end of the spectrum. Like, we have that quote from y'all about the bifurcation between utopia and dystopian. We wanted to stay in the middle.
Mm.
And so that's why the first three artifacts present, this is the promise of this technology. This is the intent. This is how we hope it works. And then our user story interviews show, okay, it doesn't quite go like that. It's mostly negative piece. And instead of presenting the design and then letting people kind of come up with their own views just based on what they see, it became weighing positive and negative throughout the piece, right? Every time we take something positive, we're going to give you a possible negative on that.
I find dystopia, utopia not very generative. I think if you were to go back to your research findings, you had like 4 items or forgot what they were. And if you if you are like, all right, you take that into 4 scenarios, you're like, what's accountability look like in a world where, like in Julian's speculation, this is some weird new AirBNB business model. And there's just to pull in our business piece, what is a business model that's driving trust in co-living that might be onerous? I don't know. Anyway, that's the role of scenarios. So now you suddenly see this, like, holy crap, like the wristwatch thing, you're like, okay, that's a possible future because, I don't know, we live in this toxic environment, no one trusts each other, and it's extremely like command control, whatever. And so then you're like, you understand the world because you understand people's behaviors, and then they show up in these kinds of ways. But I think if you skip, I've found in the past, skipping some of the scenarios of the world, like multiple, at least 3, usually helps tune the thing versus just dystopic, utopic. Because someone's utopia is another person's dystopia. So I find that can be difficult to rely on.
And that's why we felt so strongly that we had to present like all sides of this to not fall into one camp or the other. But that kind of came up against another thing, which you're mentioning, which was, to us, it felt really important that all of the artifacts be interconnected and diegetic, like found artifacts of the time, versus like, I'm trying to remember the name of it and I can't, but do you know like Auger and Loiseau's like thermal imaging camera for like measuring happiness in the home? Are you familiar with that project?
Yeah.
Speculative design.
I can imagine it.
It's excellent, but the form they present it in is a bunch of like almost like engravings, like just sort of drawings of moments in time in this house, and those artifacts aren't themselves diegetic, but they represent a diegetic world, right? Like, this is a drawing of a family in a room experiencing this thing, as opposed to ours is everything is kind of in universe. And we felt very strongly that making it in universe was important, but listening to y'all talk now, maybe it's not. Like, in design fiction, to what extent do you value that concept of keeping things real versus sort of like tongue-in-cheek or representations, or like we could have done a series of drawings, for example, of like the wristwatch, or like a broken you know, a smashed device or something like that, and that would be impactful. But that, I'm not sure that we would be able to get our point across in a way without also having like an explanation, a non-diegetic explanation.
But I think Raphael makes a good point in the chat about conflict and friction.
I have not even seen the chat. Can I access the chat here?
Yeah, it's at the bottom. Just click
More. I got you.
chat to open it. I mean, I'm just thinking of things like when the Ford Taurus was introduced, it was at a time when Bezier curves were much easier in 3D stuff, something like this. And cars started all looking a lot alike. And you could imagine a speculative fiction where like you extend that and you're like, they don't look different at all. Or what? Or there's, I forget the woman's name who did a project where the family of cars are based on genetic mutation, something. Anyway, as a way that car companies would start to develop their product line. But I think that's the thing that's maybe was the hard part, was what's the friction, what's the conflict that you're pushing up? Because it's a hard thing as in a UX program where you want things to work well.
Right. So we had to create problems, right? Like we said, okay, if we did this, what could happen? But we still started from a point of, let's make something that's not perfect. Do you know what I mean? Like, let's make something that's not the best it could be, but it solves the initial problem, right? Like the AI works as conflict mediator. So people in our research talked about not liking conflict, not liking to be like, to use their words, the house mom, or, you know what I mean? Like, so we're like, give that job to the AI. But if we do that, what happens next? So that's kind of how we moved through this. But again, I'm just not sure that we did it in the best possible way. Also, quick shout out, Monsi Parikh mentioned Space 10, and Space 10 is the foundation of our whole project. We read literally, they wrote. They're amazing.
I would look at Andrew shared Monica's Protopia. You should watch. She has like a bunch of talks on YouTube, TED Talks, other talks. I think she might help a lot because, I mean, you in your slides, there's a painting whose artist name I'm Shemaya Golden or something like that. I think that's her, right? The image of the grid overlaying someone. But I think part of the other thing is like considering Black Lives Matter, et cetera, right now, even the neutrality of like the social situation of housing in this could have been an opportunity for conflict. Like who's benefiting from or not from this thing?
We dive in deep on that, like who's left out by this. Like the modern, what exists today of this non-AI driven, but like the communities are based on are these sort of corporate, like WeWork, but for living. In fact, WeWork has their own called We Live. These kind of like community home sharing spaces where they try to build this, but what it really is built for is like wealthy millennials who move around a lot and are looking for like ready-made friends and kind of morally bankrupt. And we thought, you know, we took that idea and thought, how might it look in 10 years as technology advances? That was kind of the basis of the whole thing. But yeah, again, this is all stuff that is really hard to digest down to 6 words. You know what I mean? Like we put so much in there that it's hard to, Raphael just made the point about hatred towards serious psychological misdirection. I actually was going to show you guys a quote. Yeah, so here, like, it might be even more parental talking about the AI than everyone realized. According to Dominique, mutual exasperation with the AI brought her and her roommates closer together. It reminds me of bonding with my siblings over our parents being annoying, she laughs. It is a little ironic, though. At the end of the day, the damn thing is still working as intended. It's building community. So, like, that's a concept we definitely thought through, but the best way we could represent it, given our skill set and time and quarantine, was as a text article. I would love to represent that concept visually or through some sort of other prototype. I'm just not really sure how to do it, being new to all this.
I feel so much of this, and I don't know what the dynamic amongst your team was, but so much of the question you're asking lies in behavior. So I don't know if you know the reality TV show, The Circle, that it was in at least 2 or 3 different countries, here, Brazil, and maybe there's a French one. But how people behave and catfishing and all those phenomenon of like when this stuff exists, how do people behave and vice versa, chicken and egg and all that. So going into that and just picking one of those as a vein to explore, I think would have got you to a place more loaded. That it's interesting in listening to the presentation, this balance of like solving a problem versus speculating on the problems that might exist. It feels like you maybe were in the middle. So I don't know what in terms of success of the project is. Trying to do both is pretty hard.
It was for us. It started as whatever we do, we're going to think about the impact of it, right? Like we're going to take this to the next step of, we're not just going to design the thing even discursively or speculatively, but we also want to like really emphasize a focus on like cultural and interpersonal impact of our designs. And I think it, as a result, kind of became this sort of like critique of solutionism. But yeah, it did end up being a lot. And I think that there's a lot of cultural commentary in here that is perhaps not directly related to, it is related to the design, but it didn't have to be in there. Do you know what I mean? Like this, the whole thing we did with the CEO and his background and his story, and his friends live there and they're assholes and they all were in a frat together at UW, like how that impacts the company. And while I think that that's true, that there are those sort of people and they do design things in a certain way based on their cultural background, that probably wasn't the most best use of our time to include, but it felt important at the moment. So you're right, we might have bitten off more than we could chew in the volume of what we tried to tackle.
To me, yeah, I gotta run, but I think it's just thinking of the order in which you lay it out. So I agree with Julian, like the watch is, so as a first introduction, you're like, okay, something's going on. And then what do you experience next? And I agree with this, your long, medium, not medium post is some like, all right, you want the full behind the curtain understanding of the gears, here it is. But I think that it's hard when you're doing this work to rest on the simple illustration of the watch. It can feel like it's not enough. But it's, to me, it's the sequence in which it gets revealed that's kind of some of the magic of this. But thanks a lot. Thanks for doing all the work and sharing it with us.
Yeah, appreciate the feedback.
Hey, Scott.
See ya.
Yeah, any other thoughts? Especially I don't know if any of you work in UX out there, but design fiction UX broadly is something that I would love to get people's thoughts on and how to advocate for it in UX spaces.
So I don't work directly in UX, but like most of us have like interest in kind of broadly stakes in it. And in my mind, there's a really unique and compelling opportunity because Scott sort of pointed out, as we all sort of know, like typically design creates the perfect ideal path through translating an idea into some kind of form. And I think the way to employ design fiction in that is to essentially do, like best outcomes, acceptable outcomes, and problem areas. In other words, it kind of triples the work to a certain degree, but not completely, but just like, here's what our UX flow is going to look like. And, isn't this perfect? But here are where things could potentially be problem areas. And you do that not to like make fun of the whole idea, but in order to identify potential areas where there will be problems or failures, where the design will break. And sometimes it's just a modality, a way of approaching the design problem so that you can actually fix those things before they happen. But also there are things where it's like, look, this is an area that we flagged as potentially a problem, but solve it, but it's not necessarily possible to solve it. As a matter of fact, it might be such an outlier thing that it's just impossible to solve, but we can be aware that it might happen for some people sometimes. So, a really kind of mundane example is this terrible loop that Nick Foster and I got into while setting up a Squarespace website. And Squarespace gives you the opportunity to link your Squarespace account to a G Suite account, so you can have email for your domain name. So like super boring stuff, but also hygiene. Probably like zillions of people are doing this every day. And we were stuck in a loop where basically Squarespace would not let us activate the G Suite account. They said, you got to go to G Suite in order to do it there. And G Suite said, you can't do it from this side. You got to go to Squarespace. So it becomes a thing, like no idea what's going on there, but it forces us down a hole into which the only real solution is to call up Squarespace and potentially call up whatever G Suite is. And so you can't really anticipate that necessarily as a problem. Well, you can kind of sort of anticipate it. Like we're doing this kind of collaboration with this separate company, and there could be some things that they change on their side without notifying us, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then it allows you to have a conversation about how do we respond to, in the user experience, how do we respond to like kind of intractable, unsolvable problems that people might have. So I think, I'm a big fan of the, the 70-20-10 rule, like 70%, everything works out fantastic and you get your year-end bonus. 20% of the time, it's not that great. You really didn't, whatever happened the problem isn't completely solved. And 10% is just like complete failure and everything breaks down. And so integrating that as a part of the UX process, I think is one approach. And doing it with, by telling stories that make it more compelling to imagine that these things can happen.
That makes sense. I think we found that design fiction helped us, like it taps into a different emotional vein, I think, than a lot of UX work does, and thus might be there's a value add there, I think, for both users and stakeholders and designers in the like helping them connect better with these possible impacts. Have you found that to be true? Like versus like saying this might be a possible outcome of our design versus here's a fictional scenario I created that, feels more real. Is that a sort of space you've worked in or an attempt you've made to kind of hammer a point home or to help people realize how something might turn out?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I mean, I guess less in UX in particular and more in, well, I guess, just other kind of like future thinking contexts. And then, and sometimes it's not necessarily like the opposite of perfect. Sometimes it's just kind of like, this is how it might end up.
Yeah.
Design, talking about workplace futures and talking about that through a design, a diegetic prototype in the form of like a Hyperloop ticket is like one example I can think of. So it's like, we talk about like bright gleaming futures of Hyperloops, where you can, I can live in Los Angeles and commute to San Francisco in 12 minutes or whatever it is. But then how do you kind of build that story out by just representing what the experience of commuting might be like, and through through a ticket, like literally a paper ticket.
Yeah. That's
Is-
actually really powerful.
Julian, can I jump in quickly? Spencer, I wondered if there was a way of phrasing what Julian and Scott mentioned earlier, because at the beginning of the presentation, you were talking about 3 parallel strands of the types of narrative that you might want to consider throughout the design. And I wondered if there's opportunity to have a 4th one there, which is more talking about if you were in a work context rather than it being a project contained within uni, that you're needing to consider what the impact is that you're trying to achieve for someone engaging with the project itself. And so if you were wanting to pitch design fiction as a tool, and a tool that can help demonstrate a narrative, and that narrative becomes a case for further action to be taken, it's not just how do people engage with the design fiction, but what's the impact you're trying to have with fiction in a much broader context. And so maybe that's another parallel to have been considering. And if you were to pitch this project again in the future, to be considering if someone were to engage with that fiction, what is their experience of it, and what are they taking away? So what are their takeaways of that fictional world, and how might that affect the way they may engage? So if it were put into like a business context, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's a phenomenal point. I think one issue that I think we had that I didn't really quite realize until you were talking was that we didn't really have a stakeholder, right? Like, we weren't building for a particular audience. We weren't building it for a company or for a project. We were just kind of like saying, let's see what happens. You know what I mean? Like, we're going to follow this human-centered design process to a point where something comes out of it. And I think had we had a stakeholder, or had we had a specific project that we were given versus when we generated ourselves, I think maybe the question I'm asking would feel less nebulous. I think you're 100% correct. And that's a really interesting way to look at it. And I would love to take this approach to an existing problem or an existing project, as opposed to just something spun out of whole cloth.
It's almost like what Julian was talking about at the beginning with the spreadsheet and different ways that you can take information and get people to engage. And really, you're trying to arrive at people having a perspective that they didn't have previously. And your different tools allow you to see different context. And so in terms of how you could pitch that design fiction is necessary or suitable, you're able to kind of put it again into a narrative that you're saying, by having this mechanism or this lever, we anticipate or we hope that we can allow people to have this understanding or this state at the end that they may not have had prior to engaging with it. And then that could be layered up. And so maybe that's a way from a UX point of view that you could incorporate it.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I think that really, upon reflection for me, that seems like the missing piece, kind of. Like, when when our user is just, when we think of them as an audience versus like a user or stakeholder, what we're really just trying to do is get them to think and maybe spark some delight, right? Like, we want them to enjoy our project. And at the end, we want them to go, hey, you know, I'm going to think about this for a second. But we really didn't have much more than that by virtue of not really having a stakeholder or not having a specific problem we were solving. But
or I guess alternatively, it becomes an experiential thing that's, say, in terms of a form of interactive exhibition, that you're saying, let us take you on a journey to experience a future world. But those are two different types of extreme, I guess, because one is immersing people and allowing them to consider what it might be to be in that situation. But then the other extreme is to be using the fiction as a leverage to achieve something, and it then has a purpose that's different from the experience in and of itself.
No, that's an excellent point. I think we're kind of caught between those two. Like we're always taught that the first question we should ask, right, is like, who is the user? And for us, it started out as people who live together, but then it became a lot bigger than that when we felt like the problems of people living together are largely unchanging. So we had to sort of invent our own, if that makes sense. And that's where we ended up.
Because it's almost as though the people living in a co-living situation, rather than being the user, they're the subject, but that you're using them to expose dynamics around AI or companies that have power dynamic.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But,
thank you.
Thank you for sharing it with us. Though.
Yeah, that was very insightful. Jen, Dev, do you guys have anything that you want to ask or add to this?
No, I'm good for now. This was really helpful. A lot to think about for further steps. Yeah, thank you all for hearing us out.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having us on. I don't know if anyone else had a comment they wanted to give. I'm absolutely down to talk about this more, but also if you guys have other things you want to talk about, I don't want to take up too much time.
I'll jump in really quick since you asked for kind of UX people specifically. So I'm a UX consultant,
For sure.
doing various UX jobs the last 20 years, and I don't use diegetic prototypes in the most tangible sense, but I use storytelling and story representations for many years now, from textual narrative, storyboarding, hoping to get into using more film for that. And I think kind of what you mentioned about not having a stakeholder, I think that's really important, in that the way I frame my UX work is that kind of movement of outcome over output, output being wireframes, the actual product, like an app or a website or a thing, where people kind of focus on making the output, where in the work I do, we focus on outcomes. And so to do that, you need to have the stakeholder, the customer, user, the human beings that you can say, what is their behavior and emotion like now? And then that way you can have measurable outcome, where the outcome is a change in that behavior that helps them, hopefully, and also drives the business results of whoever your client might be, if you have a client, so to speak. So I think that's really key. So again, the more you make it real in terms of what outcomes you're going to be able to measure, the more useful the stories as prototypes or diegetic prototypes can be, because then you can actually measure them. I know that, like Julian's work, let's say the near future lab, I always frame it as my work is like nearer future, or nearer, a lot nearer, helping a client next week rather than maybe 30 years from now. But I see a huge value to stories, diegetic prototypes and stories in any way, in any form, for UX work, in that because of brain chemistry and so on, stories can feel more real to us. Absolutely. Or as real as it would be in the future, compared to a prototype that is limited by definition. So
yeah, I mean, like, we were already making user stories and personas. It seemed like a very easy next step to then just create a story out of that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. In my work, if you're familiar with personas, and Alan Cooper, my work in this started 20 years ago, looking at Cooper's work in personas, scenarios, the context scenarios, which focus on what is being accomplished, not how, and so on. And then it's an easy extension from that kind of mindset into more realistic fictional scenarios.
Yeah, I think that what you're talking about with outcomes too, we didn't have an outcome in mind when we started this. We said, we want to look at people living together, and we're going to do as much human-centered research as we can on it, and then figure out where to go from there. And our professors were like really hardcore, like, don't start designing until you've done all the research. So we very intentionally went into it without an outcome, but I think in retrospect, that was perhaps the wrong move. And we had a design question, but it was pretty broad, of just, how will technology affect people living together type thing. So yeah, I think that you raise an excellent point, that had we been more outcome focused and less output focused, we may have created something very different.
Yeah, and to be clear, I don't mean necessarily that I didn't mean to intend that you would have a planned outcome. It's just that whatever that outcome, intended, unintended, whatever it happens to be, you have a way to see what it is. Even if it's really just having a story of the future that doesn't exist, and the outcome is seeing how people react to it emotionally and being able to measure that in some valid way.
That I think that last part you just said was the closest we had to a desirable outcome, which was provoke discourse, right? And I think that's a piece that we have a comment section at the bottom, but that's the kind of closest we get to a sort of an interactive way to help to get people to engage with this. Like, it's tough to provoke discourse when there's not a forum for them to do so. For something along these lines, like, how have you guys gone down this road before of when I'm going to make something discursive and I want people to have that discourse, how do you ensure that it happens? How do you ensure that they feel like they can exchange ideas with one another as they experience these projects? That's okay. We couldn't come up with a way either. So maybe that's something to continue thinking about.
Hey guys, one other idea just occurred to me. I lead a UX team and we do a lot of enterprise software and solutions. And I thought it'd be really funny to do a fictional system diagram that maybe showed, like, you know, what are the AI algorithms, you know, what is the natural language processing that's happening, and show how, you know, and have it be pure fiction, but almost look real. Could be really an interesting diagram to show how the machine works with the people living in the space to ultimately help them drive the behaviors that you're looking for, and then also flag the ones that aren't working. Could be just a fun exercise for you guys, and I bet it would be a neat slide in any future version of this.
That's a really good idea. Yes, more.
It could be really funny too, right? Like, hide the humor in what the NLP is doing or something like that. Could be really interesting.
Yeah, and it really fits with our approach in general, but that whole concept of like creating UX artifacts as final deliverables didn't really occur to us until like a little too late in the process. But that is like something like a system diagram or just an interaction map or something like that would have made an excellent artifact of itself, and we could have done it in a diegetic way. Like, we could have incorporated it into this piece or something like that as a reference, as its own thing. But yeah, I think you're 100% right on that front.
I was just thinking that one more artifact that you could have done, since it was a co-living space, could be designing a rental agreement where, you know, maybe the things that you're most excited as a company to tell your potential customer about might be in bigger text, easily legible, and then it just kind of gets progressively smaller and smaller. That itself could also sort of signal the things that you want people to take away from this, and then also kind of raise a flag saying that, hey, you know what, something's off because I can't even read this text and I'm expected to sign off on this. So something just as simple as that can also provoke a conversation.
I love that. That's excellent. And as I mentioned, we kind of thought about doing something along those lines, like instruction manual, welcome packet, stuff like that. But something like an actual rental agreement is pretty hilarious, and would definitely have gotten that point across if we could trick our users into reading it, right? Like, that was an issue for us, as well as like, what do we think that people will be willing to consume? And I think, and that's another place where the project suffered from lack of having a specific user or lack of having a specific sort of focus, is when we're trying to appeal to everyone, we took a broader approach than perhaps something like a legalistic agreement. But I think that for a specific audience, especially a UX audience, that would have been really, really excellent.
I think there are also ways that you can use those forms, and my just realizing as we're talking that my instinct is usually to like you know, be as thorough as possible. So if I were to, you know, do the just great suggestion of doing a rental agreement, or, you know, whatever, like manual for your room, or these kinds of things that begin to tip into, you know, this different world that you're living in, that's sometimes it's enough to do the first couple of pages in a way. Like you don't have to, you're just doing it to enough of a degree that you begin to suggest or imply some of the facets of this world that you're describing in the longish medium post, and kind of hinting at them. The other, similar to sixth world fiction, is a genre called hint fiction, or at least I have a book called Hint Fiction, which is in that same style, where you're just kind of like intimating some aspects of the world that you want to represent, but you don't necessarily need to be complete to the point of like getting the actual legal document, you know, the 26-page thing all done. I think that's another approach to doing these things. And I think, you know, like overall the purpose is, as I see it, is to you know, open up the topic to consideration, and not necessarily provide instruction or direction about how this world will be created. So in that sense, implying things rather than actually creating them through and through, which is why I like the you know, the kind of like the Apple Watch, like it hints at so much that at least for me makes me want to dig in further. It makes me want to talk more to you about, you know, some of those ideas. And you know, it's almost like leading into or being, or like the instead of doing the whole film, you just do the trailer for the film. You're like, all right, I got it. I get what's going to happen in it, and that just seeing the trailer was enough. That's what the Apple Watch image does for me. And however you kind of like follow that through, is almost fine to a certain degree. It just tips into the world a bit.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that especially what you're just saying about like the trailer and whatnot and fractions of pieces, that makes a lot of sense. I think again, we got caught up heavily in this idea that everything had to be diegetic and complete and done to a high degree of fidelity. How do you represent a partial artifact? Like how do you sell it, I guess?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think that's part of the craft of design fiction. I'm not sure I'm not sure what the 1, 2, 3 steps are.
Is this something that you've encountered in work you've done, where you have created like a part of some, like, did you guys do the blood bags, or was that, I'm getting all the various speculative design, and
That was done in Raby.
Done in Raby. Thank you, Dev. Like some projects, I think the concept is simple enough and impactful enough that a piece of it can tell the story. I think we looked for that and couldn't find it, and so we went with a more scattershot approach. But I think what we lacked in focus, we made up for in thoroughness.
Yeah, I think you kind of inverted the you know, the model that I oftentimes think of, just not as the model, but just my personal preference, which is just the ephemera that lies around the room rather than the room itself. You know, I sort of tip back. I guess, you know, I've learned a lot from working with Nick Foster, and he's got his principle of the future mundane. So like focusing on the kind of mundane aspects, which is why I like.
Yeah, we reference that a lot.
Sorry?
We reference that a lot, like the future mundane concept.
Yeah, and that's why. Yeah, sorry, go on.
No. I was just, I just wanted to agree.
Sure, which is why my personal inclination is for things like the Hyperloop ticket, as opposed to the specification sheet for how do you build a Hyperloop, or the you know, when we did a workshop on the UX workshop on the self-driving car, the objective was to create the quick start guide, which is not the whole car. Like, I think most people, their inclination would be like to design the car as opposed to the instructions for it. And that's just a particular preference. And I was asked last week by a friend who's kind of, you know, developing a design fiction curriculum. Yeah, he's like, well, how do you get to the Hyperloop ticket as opposed to the Hyperloop? And I'm not entirely sure yet. I don't know, but I think that definitely has something to do with both it's a slightly lighter lift, and although it does require, you know, quite a bit of energy to kind of get it dialed in, but it's just I guess, you know, observing the background, like just being super into like things that, it's a joke, you know, in my household that like if I had an acting job, my ideal acting job would be of the building super who the cop just asked like, hey, which way did they go? And that was it. Like just those little connectors that kind of move action in and around the world, and that are really what, I mean, it's like they're like the subatomic particles of our lived experience, like the things that we have around us. And I just find that way more interesting than the bigger picture.
I agree with you. Do you feel like what, not so much does experience play a role, but to what extent does, like, you've been working in this space for a long time, like us as students, as relatively new to this, we want to design the Hyperloop. We don't see the ticket, but you look at that whole possibility and you can focus on that one artifact. Do you think that a lot of that is the level of exposure you've had to this over the years? Or do you know what I mean? Like the ability to look at the most mundane and see the possibility in it. Is that a learned skill?
I think it can be learned. I think it's like the power of, you know, like observation, which is another little section of the book that we've been working on, and actually it's like a whole channel in our Slack, is to really be you're training your eye to notice things that don't typically get noticed, and I think that's definitely a skill that can be developed. I don't know what the system necessarily is, but I'm sure that one could sort of fairly easily be defined. As it's a kind of like peripheral reference, but we especially Nicholas Nova he's like our kind of resident observer of curious, bizarre things, and it brings so much. Just seeing what he sees and him sharing the things that he notices is part of like kind of developing that ability to see the unseen. But then also in a kind of more formal sense, like there's an anthropologist called Anna Singh who I came across when I was at grad school at UC Santa Cruz. She's an anthropologist, and she has this kind of approach to the art of noticing that she describes in her book, The Mushroom Hunters. Wait, I probably totally got that wrong. The whole section, yeah, sorry, The Mushroom at the End of the World. And it's a book about a lot of things, but the mushroom is a figure that features in it insofar as she learns how to see the way mushroom hunters do, and that becomes this kind of through line for her about kind of observation and noticing. And there was a podcast recently where she refers to that. I'm just going to see if I can quickly find the link for it. But I think, so that to your point, I think yes. So I think being able to find that ability, just like we have that kind of instinct, I suppose, or our first kind of go-to thing is to think about and worry about the big thing rather than the little thing, and the little thing might be what matters most. And I think, I just kind of spouted it out, but that metaphor of the subatomic particles being the thing you actually want to really be looking for the purposes of the kind of work that we do is maybe apt, because it's like, they're the every once and again there'll be a report from some kind of like high energy particle physics world where it's like it's not the planets, it's like the glue, and we can't see the stuff, but it's there, and it's actually the thing that is that holds the universe together and all that. I think that's maybe helpful in this context.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. The mushroom hunting analogy really resonated with me too. Like learning how to see, like learning how to look and notice those smaller elements is something that I hope I continue to develop over the course of my career, because it seems like a really useful skill.
It's a bit like kind of having smoke and mirrors, because you had a page to a web page, but you didn't have to create the website.
Mm-hmm.
But you had an artifact that allows people to consider what if that was represented in the future in a particular way. But if you're staging things for people to be exposed to, you only need to have partial elements for someone to imagine what it would be like if you had that interaction. And so it's kind of a way of staging and then having the smoke and mirrors that doesn't mean you have to build the thing in real terms.
That makes a lot of sense.
When you went, so like, you know, you had the iPhone, which kind of gave this idea of the frustration being held if you're being accountable to metrics that aren't good. But if you had the flat agreement, you could have a character in the comic reacting to some form of interaction they had with it without it being a real thing. And so it's more that you're letting people know that it exists without it having to be the whole thing.
That brings up sort of an interesting point that we came up against repeatedly, which was, like we were mentioning earlier, we didn't want to fall into utopian or dystopian, but I think that there are definitely shades of bad or good in a design. And like one of our friends, when he was doing a test for us through the website, he was like, man, like I was getting some red flags through here. In design fiction, how do you like indicate to your audience, to your user, that you put those there on purpose? Do you know what I mean? Like that those aren't just you being a bad designer or you not thinking through the impacts of your design, but rather that's part of the discourse. And that's something that we really struggled with.
Do you mean people sort of like saying, like, what were the red flags? Like, ooh, your kind of kerning is off. Was it like that kind of stuff?
No. More like these, like I wouldn't want to live here type of stuff. Like I wouldn't want like my personal items to be tracked at all times. Like I wouldn't, I don't know how I feel about like the community lounges constantly recommending games for me to get to know the people around me better. Like stuff that's.
I guess it goes back to the loop of, if someone were to engage with this fiction, what is it you want them to be feeling, and how are you? It's like what Joel was saying, that if people are having an emotional state at the beginning and an emotional state at the end, so what is the journey that people are going through by engaging with that fiction? And so you're kind of provoking people, but that's part of the experience of it. So.
Yeah, Nikki, I think that's exactly the work. I mean, so it's working is what I would say.
Exactly. Yeah.
You want so that person, when they engage with it that way, you almost want to then start prompting them. You've prompted them in a significant way, and that's like amazing. Like the purpose, Fabian keeps saying, like, what it's supposed to be. Design fiction is meant to start conversations, and that's the conversation starting. And so then you engage them, like, what is it about it? And, what do you understand about this experience that makes you kind of anxious and nervous? And then, take it from there, depending on the overall objective or goal of the design fiction. So I guess I would ask you, like, what do you want people to do with this?
We wanted them to feel uncomfortable, I think, with these ideas, but we didn't want them to uncomfortably think that we didn't know it was uncomfortable. Does that make sense? Like we wanted them to be uncomfortable in a, like, oh, that's like a weird potential future sort of way, not an uncomfortable in a, wow, Spencer and his team really didn't think this through sort of way. Like, not this is a bad idea, but this is this is an interestingly bad idea.
Yeah.
Very much, Nikki, for your contributions.
Yeah, it's a good. I mean, it's good question. I'm not necessarily sure there's a way to kind of like cut that off. I think the only, I mean, one possible way would be, I think, maybe to be more, I guess, you know, just coming back to just, I mean, I took a quick look because Manzi sent the link through the, one of the pieces that her friend had put together, which was about the jester. And I think that the trickster figure is like super interesting. And so is there a way in which you can sort of, you can make the work, the creation, so like the website, tip just like a little bit more into that kind of role? So everyone knows that the jester isn't actually saying the truth, but they are saying the truth, but they're not
Right.
the ones that are actually embodying the truth. They're trying to get you to see the world a little bit differently and do it by being a trickster or a joker or a jester. So is there something you can do a little bit more? Like, I think it's all here. I mean, like that, Adam Rutledge Pike is just like a cartoon to me. But
Yeah, and that was the goal. We picked the most cartoonish image of a white businessman that we could find.
Yeah.
And that's a really good, that's why we made these ridiculous advertisements. That's why we put in like these these like, references to other evil corporations. Like, we did want to do that sort of jester wink.
Yeah.
Maybe we were worried that people just wouldn't get it, or
Yeah.
that it wasn't forceful enough.
Yeah. I mean, it might just be like a little bit more refinement of the kind of of this, to be. So like so if you scroll up or like I made maybe the security thing, I might have just used like just like an image from 2001, like just make that how.
Just literally make it okay.
Yeah, it's just like a little wink nudge, and maybe some people get it, some people don't.
Hang a lampshade on it.
Yeah, I've seen that before, and then other things, because the images are maybe just like a little bit flat in that context.
Yeah, and again, that was the struggle with diegesis, right? Of like, we base this website on other current existing co-living community websites. So for a while, this was going to be our only artifact, and then we're like, well, did we make it too believable, right? Like, that's the fiction has to be clear for people to understand the point. If they, like, one of our professors was like, maybe people will confuse it for real, and my hesitation with that is, if they confuse it for real, they'll just think we're bad designers.
Yeah. Again, another approach could have been to even go further down the kind of diegetic prototype path. So, which might have been like, just thinking about another kind of artifact besides. I know they're kind of practical constraints like time, energy, effort, skill set, and all that kind of stuff. But like making something that would be part of this world could also be, aside from a website. So like if you were to do the key to get into this space as an actual physical thing, I'm not sure, pouring other aspects of the overall conceit into that. And maybe, again, I'm just like, I just love the idea of like having just one thing that opens you into the world, as opposed to the whole world as, like, for example, representing the website, which is covering all these aspects of the world. Just have the one thing. Like if you just have like, for any one of these elements on this page here, security, community lounges, intelligent workspaces, shared meals, and so forth. If you just had like one object, like just like a packaged sandwich that's just like a little bit peculiar with an odd label on it that you just had on a table, and this is what, and you could talk about the shared meal experience, because the first thing someone's going to do is like, hey, what is that? I've never seen that. It's a sandwich with Apple branding. Hey, what's going on? And then they're asking the questions from the beginning, and you're able to, kind of fill in their inquisitiveness without kind of, necessarily being front and center with it. And that's another reason why I like the kind of the made physical artifact as a diegetic prototype, even to a certain degree more than just kind of like screen stuff, like, like the website, which I think is super awesome, but just thinking about other possible forms to begin to suggest or intimate the world, and other possible forms that prompt people to be the first ones to ask about it, as opposed to you saying, we did this project, here's the link to it. Just being like, not telling them anything, but your project is embedded in this Hyperloop ticket that they happen to see on the table. Or, this odd Apple branded fast food.
Yeah, that was a point that one of our professors brought up, was the value of enticement, to the point of maybe someone being like, wait, is this real?
Mm-hmm.
And kind of doing that, like encouraging them to do their own research by drawing their interest that way. And I don't think we ever really found the right way to do that. But I think a lot of the stuff you're talking about, I think we went big to small, and maybe we should have gone small to big. And like let those smaller things do more work in this space. But yeah, this has been phenomenally helpful, and we've kept you over 2 hours now, so I really appreciate it.
No, it's good. It's good stuff. I really appreciate you sharing it, and congratulations on the work. Just one last point that who knows, maybe we might be here for hours, but the going big to small, I think is or, whatever way you go, I think even starting big and then, and doing the work and doing the thinking and debating and the kind of frustration and confusion, and then all of a sudden realizing like, oh, okay, so let's just do the credit card or whatever. Like, you find the little thing in the process, and part of the process and how you get to the Hyperloop ticket or to the Apple branded shared meal takeout thing, or the legal description or whatever, is by looking at the overall context and allowing yourself to kind of wander in and around it, as much as making sure that you're not rushing to the finish of the project, allowing the having the patience and the kind of persistence to kind of go through everything and just find that one element that maybe helps to tell the story better rather than the overall narrative. But then you have all that background material that you can pull from, and not all of it needs to be the final output. I mean, matter of fact, most of it could just lie in behind the scenes stuff, which is another cinematic metaphor. It's like there's so much else going on that you never ever see, but contributes to the overall story. And the overall story might just be, in Pulp Fiction, Marcellus Wallace's the suitcase that everyone wants. For some reason that we don't know.
MacGuffin.
Suitcase, yeah. MacGuffin.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think there's a lot in there that's the product of like subtlety and nuance, that hopefully are things we continue to refine over time as we get better at this.
Cool. All right. That was amazing. That was really good.
Thank you so much for having us on. It's great to talk about this with such people. We worked really hard on it, but we don't think it's perfect, and it can always be for more learning. So yeah, thank you so much for this, and we will hear from us again.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks everyone. Thanks for hanging out. Our marathon 2-hour session. And everyone have a great weekend.
Thanks so much.
You too. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.